Okay, resuming my discussion of the first civil war in Lebanon, to resume the explanation of that war, Shamoun really begged us to come in and to help him out so that the traditional conservative group will be able to keep their control of Lebanon. He really truly manipulated our hypersensitivity and Cold War mentality so that he could become president for a second term and establish a hegemony of traditional / Maronite forces with our backing. And again, remember, as a reminder, the Constitution of Lebanon prohibited a second term for an incumbent president. Now, to our credit, after a few months, our people, our ambassador there, began to really see the situation and see this conflict clearly, and the conflict quickly came to an end. So the conflict was resolved, and after a few months we were there. What happened was Shamoun was kicked out, and he didn't get a second term. And as you can imagine, the Maronite who became president was no other than the commander-in-chief. Shahab became the president, and for prime minister, according to the confessional system, the prime minister had to be Sunni. The prime minister of all the people that one can imagine, the very target of the United States policy, who was seen by us as being the leading agent of Soviet Union in Lebanon, became the prime minister with our blessing, Rashid Karimi. So you can imagine that there was some very important learning on the part of the United States during that experience. And remember, the Civil War in many ways was precipitated by the Eisenhower Doctrine that encouraged the traditional forces to try to monopolize power. So to summarize the major elements in the 1957-58 conflict, let me briefly review it. So the summary was basically in the following manner. The Civil War was really primarily in response to the acceleration of pace of change, the change process that had now come to Lebanon, and the traditional elements were being defeated by the natural forces of change. And they were making really their last stand, hoping that the United States would support them against the progressive elements, and the best way to have the United States sucked in was to manipulate our fear of communism so we would come there and help them out. That was the first element in that conflict. The second element, of course, was that it was a sectarian conflict as well. The Maronites were united in this civil war with the traditional elements on one side of the Civil War versus the progressive elements and other sects, mostly the Sunnis, but also other, on the other side. Third, very important element, an important ingredient in instantiating the Civil War was external factor, and the external factor was the one I mentioned to you, the Eisenhower Doctrine. And when the doctrine on January 5th of 1957, when it was broadcasted, as soon as they learned about that, the traditional leaders began to believe that now the United States will support them, and Shamoun was willing to take on his tormentors. So that's how that Civil War began. So in 1958, he finally gets help from us after much solicitation. One of the factors that forces us to go initially to help Shamoun, at the end we'll actually abandon him, but initially we went to help him, and one of those factors was Around that time, there was a coup in Iraq that overthrew the Hashemite king, the cousin of King Hussein of Jordan. He was overthrown, and when that happened, we interpreted the Iraqi coup as being a pro-Nasser coup. That was a complete misinterpretation, because as subsequent event would show, Qasem, who became Iraq's president, was really Iraqi nationalist and not at all pro-Nasser. If there was any commonality between the two, was their in some ways their anti-American, anti-British sentiment. So at the time of the Iraqi coup, we certainly viewed it as being a pro-Nasser, pro-Arab nationalist, and since the Arab nationalism were identified being on the Soviet side, we decided to help our conservative traditional allies. And our theory was that by showing will and determination, the Soviet Union will understand that they should not enter what really is their own backyard. So we're going to defend our allies, and to that end, we decided to send Marines to Lebanon, and of course the British sent troops to Jordan to shore up King Hussein. Now, I want to tell you about the Marines' first encounter with the enemy, quote unquote. It was really a memorable experience for our Marines. Marines make their amphibious landing on the Beirut beaches. And so now imagine you have the battle-ready Marines being greeted by a bunch of young adolescents who open their jacket and they're trying to sell pornographic pictures to our Marines. So our Marines' first encounter with the enemy was really pornography. So you can imagine how confused they were, and they were just wondering, who is the enemy that we have landed here and trying to take on? Anyway, as I mentioned, it took only a few months for us to understand Shamoun's machination, and to his dismay and amazement because he never thought we'd be smart enough to understand and figure him out, we saw the situation very clearly, and we simply dumped him. So that's how that conflict came to an end. So with the end of the Civil War, you have this wonderful peace and tranquil period in which Lebanon prospers, and this is from 1958 until 1978. So in this period, what you have is the kind of break that Lebanon needs to begin to prosper. And in those years from 1958 until the mid-1970s, it looked like Lebanon will be stable and actually will move in the direction of becoming a nation state. In other words, this notion of an encompassing Lebanese identity that would supersede individual sectarian clan identities was in the making. Now, I should mention that Lebanon is a gorgeous, beautiful area on the Mediterranean. It really is an ideal place to become the financial center of the region and certainly of the Arab world. In other words, Lebanon should and could and should become the Switzerland of the Arab world. And remember, the rich Arabs live in a desert, very, very hot and almost unbearable climate of the Persian Gulf. So for them, Lebanon is their vacation, it's their southern France, if you like. And indeed, Lebanon was moving very, very strongly in that direction. So you have Lebanon prospering. The financial centers of Lebanon are gaining in strength daily. And as Lebanon develops as it economically becomes more prosperous, you can see the forces of change once again really take charge, which means the traditional clan, the traditional element is losing power, and the commercial element is on the ascendancy. So it all looks very, very good for Lebanon. Then all of a sudden, everything changes. So this very much leads me to the Great Civil War of 1975 till 1990. So you can see that from the duration of it, certainly it deserves the term great, but in terms of casualty, it certainly also deserves that title as well. Now notice, up to now, we had not even mentioned anything about the Palestinians. Why were they not mentioned, even though they were in Lebanon? The Palestinians were already in Lebanon. That's because they really were not involved in the first civil war. The Great Civil War, for the explanation of the Great Civil War, you really should go back to the Palestinian camps. Going back to the origin of the Palestinian diaspora, in 1948, after the Deir Yassin massacre, which we discussed, most Palestinians fled east to Jordan, but some also fled north into Lebanon. Roughly, again, these data are not always the best, but the estimate is around 150,000 actually went already to Lebanon, and they were there. During that period, right after 1948, the United States was really truly committed to the Palestinian repatriation. Indeed, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 192. So Resolution 192 in 1948 called for the Palestinian repatriation, and we supported, the United States voted in support of that resolution. If you update to 1993, the United States switched its position. So by 1993, President Clinton made yet another concession to Israel, and he reversed American support for something they had voted on back in 1948. So by 1993, we no longer support the repatriation. Few Americans are aware of this, but this is what happened. Anyway, so you have the Palestinian moving out of what became Israel in mass exodus. Many went to Jordan. About 150,000 went to Lebanon. And we are trying to, by passage of 192, to assure the repatriation. But as we try to do that, we suddenly run into exquisite Zionism, and it seems clear that Israel is not going to be compelled to accept these refugees. So from 1950 until 1967, we as Americans at least had a sense of responsibility and some recognition that we had created this refugee mess by pushing for the partition plan in Palestine, and therefore we should do whatever we can to repatriate them. And then we have the situation in 1967, the catastrophic Arab defeat when Israel preemptively attacked Egypt, Syria, and Arab were defeated. As a result of that defeat, the sense of efficacy in the Arab world, which I mentioned several times, it really was a turning point, the 67 war. And basically what happened was by 1967, we pretty much knew it was all over. the Palestinians were not going to get repatriated. So the peace and prosperity, therefore, was a very, very important aspect for Lebanon, but then suddenly it came to a precipitous end